Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. Welcome to Friday night's video in our second Master Series. I do believe this is the 113th video in our second Master Series, the 62nd video in our basic processors, the 25th video in sculpting processors, and the second video on harmonics. And in this video, we're just going to talk about basic usage application kind of things. And it's a pretty simple concept. The first thing you really have to remember whenever you're working on harmonics and things like that is that whenever you're working on them, that most of the time they're bouncing around. Now this part right here is staying in a fairly general area, but a lot of times the harmonics will move, this envelope of sound will move up the octave range in the spectrum and down in the spectrum. And as it does that, and as it changes, or as you sing different, or you perform differently, or do different articulations on instruments, or whatever you might be doing, or different way of articulating vocals, that the harmonic component and the shape can change. So sometimes you really have to work on separate sections. Like you might have a verse or part of a verse, you know, or just maybe a couple words in the verse before it changes the way it articulates, or its range or its shape, or between that and the chorus and the bridge, and you might cut it up in a lot of different ways. Because each little section, you know, if I'm doing the vocal and the verse and it's, you know, da 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 ba, that might be different on that next part, you know, and then I come down real low, you know, and then it's going to be different there. So you have to really keep that in mind, that it can be a difficult task sometimes, especially when you're dealing with people that are really phenomenal vocalists or musicians, that they have a lot of control and they utilize everything. And you got to really be careful of getting lost in some productions or some tracks, that you just don't get, you know, lost during every word, syllable, and everything. You're going through the whole thing, that, you know, you're really sucking the life out of it. So you got to kind of be careful. You know, you take it to some point when you're doing good and not, you know, overdoing it to where it's like, you know, you've crossed the line from trying to, you know, sculpt somebody's sound into total perfection, where, you know, you really want to enhance it. If they're that bad of a vocalist, then, you know, does that make sense? And if they're a good vocalist and you want to enhance it, not, you know, die in front of the processing board trying to, you know, make it something that it's never, it just isn't. Does that make sense? So really keep that in mind. The next thing I want to talk about is that, you know, basically whenever we're dealing with harmonics, like this is a saw or a ramp wave, it's got even and odd harmonics at a fairly even gradual decline. And these are even and odd harmonics that are normally inherent in a lot of sounds. A lot of sounds will have either even harmonics, odd harmonics in different shapes, or even and odd harmonics in different shapes, with some non-harmonic distortion. As things tail off in the sound, you get a lot of, you know, things happening that cause non-harmonic distortion and things like that as it tails off. And as they go up in the spectrum, things start to compress. And so sometimes it's very difficult to work with the upper spectrum, except for very broad band, like with equalization. So don't really keep that in mind. A lot of the most pertinent harmonics you're going to be dealing with is maybe the first 10, 12, 15 harmonics, that most of the time. Does that make sense? And anything after that, unless it's really affecting the sound, that you're really trying to, you know, shape the harmonics with the primary harmonics, the fundamental and the primary harmonics off of it. So if you got like a saw ramp wave, you've got even in harmonics. A square wave, just odd harmonics for the most part going across there, and you can see this little bit of non-harmonic distortion in the square wave, but it was pretty clean. Triangle wave, a lot of odd harmonics. And, you know, and they all have footprints, like we talked about when we were talking about mapping out footprints when doing, doing with your spectrogram and with your oscilloscope, so you can really map things out so you can have a really good idea of what's happening there. But when you start getting into something, you're basically dealing with even odd harmonics and some non-harmonic distortion. And there isn't really anything else. And the problem with non-harmonic distortion is where exactly it's going to lay. And it can have an effect because this non-harmonic element would be right here that's going to affect the sound at this level. Now, if it's off in frequency up a little bit or down a little bit, it's going to have a different effect on it. So really taking some time to really analyze non-harmonic distortion is a really good thing for you to do. And, spend some time really experimenting with that and read about it a little bit, because it's normally fairly difficult to deal with, but some added in there sometimes is not a bad thing. It can really breathe life into a sound, because if you have something like you're getting into a vocal and it's got even and odd harmonics coming off here, and as it goes up, you can see as it moves around, the envelope changes a lot. It's not like an ADSR when people talk about an envelope of sound as an attack, an ADSR, and it's not like that. I mean, it really sometimes just doesn't work that way, Does that make sense? And there's a prime example right here. This ADSR has multiple facets to it. So, and as these move around, that you're trying to sculpt some of these individual harmonics, whether they're even or odd, to try and enhance the sound. In some vocalists or in some instruments, that if I push up this third, it's really going to enhance it. Or if I attenuate it a lot, it can enhance it. Or it could be this third and this root over here that are really causing the issue in this certain sound. And it takes some experimentation and really messing around with it to really try to map it out. It's why I always try to get you a testing sound, like get a vocalist or a guitar or whatever, and da, 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 something so that you can really look at the harmonic components and experiment around with it, see what you could add or attenuate to try to help sculpt the sound some, or whatever processing you might be doing. But it's a really good idea in this area, because harmonics can be just a really pain in the butt, because you never know. It might be this flat seventh needs to get boosted or attenuated because it's really causing a problem. Like you get people who say that you get this honky whininess around 500 hertz that really messes up the sound. That depends on the production, right? But in some cases, yeah, and you want to attenuate in a certain area on that sound. It can be the same thing. So it can be kind of complicated depending on what sound you're working with. Here's an accordion, here's a bell, and here's a drum. Even drums, when you're doing a production, if you can center somewhere in the lower end, find a center frequency to center your drums on and tune them to the key the production's in, and keep them in key, your toms and it will actually help the sound of the production. It's tuning your drums to the actual song. And with DAWs, you can do it really easily. It doesn't take much to retune it a little bit. But there's harmonic content in here. There's all kinds it looks like noise with saturation, but there's harmonic content in there, and you adding harmonic content in there to try to sculpt the sound a little bit, you can, make the drum sound better. You may not, a lot of people will think there's drums that's soft or it's hard or something like that. Well, that's not all the components in any drum. There's harmonic content in there, and you can see how the envelope of sound is shaped here. The envelope goes like this. So, reshaping the envelope to try to make it sound a little bit different, to give it a little bit different textures. Harmonics can help with that, not just equalization. You can actually add harmonics to it to try to do it. But for the most part, whenever you're trying to deal with harmonics, is you're normally dealing with even and odd harmonics and possibly a little bit of non-harmonic distortion. And normally you're trying to take something that's happening there, some of these harmonic components, and either boosting them or attenuating them. And sometimes it can be very surgical work, or just this fifth that you really need to attenuate it or boost it or add some to it or something that just makes it sound right there. It's just like you take your equalizer, and there's sometimes I'm like, it's like, 0.2%, and it's like, that hit it. Yeah, dude, I'm listening, all right. Yeah, that'll be perfect. Sometimes it is that way. It depends on how acute of a listener, how critical of a listener you are, of how critical you are of the sound, so that it sounds as good as possible. So I mean, it's going to take some experimentation on your part, but it's pretty simple. That's basically what you're trying to deal with. And it's not that difficult a concept. The difficult part is you experimenting with it and practicing attenuating and boosting certain harmonics and listening to see what happens to different sounds. If I boost the third in the vocal, what happens? I mean, what does it sound like? I mean, what does it do? If I take that test track, and I start boosting that third up, what happens? And if I attenuate it, or I boost the fifth or attenuate it, or this other root here, or this fifth here, or this flat seventh, or if I come down here and find one of these other harmonics and boost it or attenuate that, what is it doing to the sound? Or if I take two or three that are grouped together, you know, I might have this flat seventh and this harmonic, or this flat seventh and this third that I attenuate together, and let this fifth ride up. What's that doing to the sound? You know, all these things, any harmonic components in the sound and how they're laid out as far as their decibel level in relation to each other is very important to how the sound is going to sound. I mean, it sometimes does not take much of one harmonic being up a little bit or down a little bit to change the entire texture of the sound. It's quite amazing that how delicate it can be sometimes. But your job is trying to enhance it to make it sound as good as possible, or sound sculpt. You're trying to take some type of sound and make it have certain characteristics. Like you might want to be pushing the fifths up, you know, boosting the fifths on the sound, or boosting the thirds on the sound, or the flat sevenths, or the roots. So you might want to be boosting them or attenuating them to try to give a sound a certain texture. You know, does that make sense? So those are the basic usages of it, because most of the time it's an enhancement or a sculpting tool. So we're going to get into looking at some ways of doing that in the coming videos. In the next video, I do believe we're going to look at simple tools for some simple applications, so that we don't get, sometimes we can do things pretty simply and it's good to go, and we don't have to spend so much time, especially stuff that's farther back in the mix, that we don't have to be so surgical with it because of the blending and masking and all that going on when it mixes together with other sounds. So we'll take a look at that. So I hope that gives you a little bit better idea of what we're doing, and we'll get into the difficulties of the moving sound envelope as we go along, and discuss those issues that are definitely inherent anytime we work with any type of sound sculpting and harmonics, and especially things like bends and slides and all kinds of different articulations that happen with vocalists or musicians when they do things. Can be very difficult to work with, and sometimes you got to be real careful of not causing audio problems, that you've got this vocal part and it's like da, and you sculpt this beautiful, but it goes or some dang thing, you know, and you start messing with it and it causes a total mess out of that. The other part may sound great, but then it causes a mess with that. So separating things every moment in time is important, and knowing when to go, oh, I don't want to apply it to that, that one might be a problem. You know, investigating and checking that. It's a work in progress. As you become that next level master audio engineer, it's really about usage, you know, and practicing using it and seeing what happens as you do these things, because every sound is different, you know, and your opinion is going to be different than other people's of what you're trying to do. And if you're sound sculpting, nobody knows what you're looking for but you. If you're trying to get some certain type of effect from a sound, or you take a sound and sculpt it in a certain way to have some certain effect, or you might just be experimenting around and come up with something. Oh, that's really cool. I love that. Yeah, dude, splat that on there. Oh, yeah. You know, how many times I've done that. So anyway, I certainly hope you enjoyed the second video in our harmonics segment of the sculpting series. Peace, hope, love, and I will see you in the next video.